This is Judge Joe Brown, and we're listening to We All Be News, news-free Dixie for the 21st century.
Brother Grif there?
Yeah, gotcha.
All right, great. We All Be is proud to have on Arkansas historian and lawyer extraordinaire, Brother Grif Stockley, who is one of the prime resources on the Elaine, Arkansas Massacre of 1919. He wrote a book entitled Blood in Their Eyes, the Elaine, Arkansas Riots of 1919. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing fine. Let me get that title right for you, though. It's Blood in Their Eyes, the Elaine Race Massacres of 1919.
I got you. You're right.
I take exception to calling it a riot because my research has shown that, in fact, it was really two race massacres, not even just one by the mob that came into Elaine, and one, really a different one by the soldiers who came over from Camp Pike in Arkansas. But we'll get to that, I guess.
Well, actually, I'm glad you corrected me. What inspired you to write about this subject matter?
Well, I happen to be from Lee County, which is right next door to Phillips County, where all this occurred. And I had been writing, I guess, about race relations in Arkansas from the time I'd really gotten out of law school and had really wanted to know more about the history of race relations for some time. And so it was kind of a natural book for me to write. My grandmother was from Marville, which is in Phillips County, and I wish now I had enough sense to ask her about some of the things that I ended up researching because she was from Phillips County and would have known quite a bit about it. My grandfather was a physician, and I think I would have learned a lot had I had not been so self-absorbed as a teenager when I was around her. But for years, we had heard things off and on about that there had been some kind of racial event in Phillips County. It was back then, it was called a race riot, but in my research, it shows, in fact, that blacks were actually just shot down in the fields outside of Elaine, Arkansas, which is in Phillips County. The county seat is Helena, but this occurred in this town called Elaine.
Right, I know they always say the youth is wasted on the young, but really, I mean, like, as a young person, I can recall, I can show you a kind of, instance where I had my grandfather around, who was a World War II veteran, but he passed away about 6 years ago. But when I was a young person, I was really interested in all this stuff. A lot of us didn't really know a lot about that stuff, so I couldn't blame you for being young and not being aware to ask your grandparents about what they know about the massacre. But speaking of investigating the historical aspect of the massacre, how difficult was it to find resources or sources willing to talk, or was it difficult at all?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Actually, I had to go to the Wisconsin State Historical Society in Madison, Wisconsin, where a lot of the papers the massacre were stored. It turned out that an earlier historian had copied some papers, and then there had been a fire, and it turned out that the Wisconsin State Historical Society and the University of Wisconsin had become a major repository of papers dealing with civil rights. As it so happens, I had an opportunity to also write later a book about Daisy Bates, who, of course, in Arkansas is well known as a civil rights heroine. And it turns out her papers, or at least some of them, were stored in the Wisconsin State Historical Society. What happened was several universities, of course, in the 60s became interested in and knew that the civil rights period was going to be very important, and they began to ask figures like Daisy Bates for their papers. At the time, Arkansas was not that evolved in the sense that it had not really any inkling that this sort of research material was going to be important. As it turned out later, though, the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville did ask Ms. Bates for her papers, and some of her later papers are with the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. But, I mean, I've had to make 2 trips to Wisconsin to do that kind of research.
And how long did it take you to write the book in total, you think?
This book probably took about 5 years. I had a day job at the time. I was a lawyer for the Center for Arkansas Legal Services in Little Rock. We represented indigents in civil cases. And so, I really had a good background to do this kind of book simply because so much of what happened really involved the law. Just to kind of give you an overview of what happened in Elaine, this all occurred during what historians call the Red Summer of 1919. At that particular time, with African American soldiers coming back to the United States, they'd been over in Europe and in France and had been treated far differently than they were treated in the United States. And when they came back to the United States, they expected to at least be recognized for the fact that they had served in the military. And of course, it was still business as usual in the South, but also the rest of the country. And there were also a lot of labor tensions that were present at the time. There were some, major labor unions that were formed, the International Workers of the World. In fact, that's really what kind of got this started in Arkansas. There was a black labor union called the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America that had been formed by black sharecroppers. And what they were trying to do was to get a fair price for their cotton. And a man named Robert Hill formed this labor union, and they had been meeting all summer in 1919 in Phillips County around Elaine, and they had a number of they basically had several kind of units where people met. But on the night of September 30th, 1919, they were having a meeting at a place called Hoopspur. There were about 100 African Americans in this church, and the whites in that area had begun to get suspicious of what was going on, and the blacks had set out armed guards to keep people from snooping around. And sure enough, that night, the Phillips County Sheriff's Office sent out some people to take a look, and it turned out there was a shootout that night, and this white guy named W.A. Atkins got shot and killed, and it ended up being a firefight out at that church, and blacks took off, and then whites, as that would happen from time to time, panicked, thinking that there was going to be some kind of, as they called it, an insurrection. In that area of Phillips County, there were about 9 to 1 African Americans for every white in that particular area, and so the whites basically panicked and sent out a call for whites to come in, white males to come in to Phillips County, and that's basically what happened. The next day, between 600 and 1,000 whites poured into Phillips County and began to shoot down blacks. Also what happened was the whites in Elaine were worried that because of the number of blacks in the county, they ended up sending 3 telegrams to the governor of Arkansas in Little Rock, a guy named Charles Hillman Bruff. And Bruff contacted the War Department in Washington, D.C., and asked for permission to have troops sent from Camp Pike. And there was kind of a delay, bureaucratic delay, but finally, by midnight, you had a troop train from Camp Pike armed with 10 machine guns. There were, I think there were around 583 soldiers, and these guys were basically battle-tested. They had fought at the Second Battle of the Marne, and came over on the train and showed up in Elaine the next morning at 8 o'clock, and basically sent out their troops to look for African Americans, and sure enough, my research shows that there is basically a number of kind of second-hand accounts which show this an indiscriminate shooting on the part of the troops, and there are all kinds of different estimates as to how many African Americans were killed, and they range from really an incredible number of like 850. There was a man named Sharp Dunaway, who had been a reporter for the Arkansas Gazette, who wrote a book, What a Preacher Saw Through a Keyhole, and he estimated, without really any documentation, of this incredible number of over 800 African Americans who were shot down in the fields. The NAACP estimated 250 African Americans were killed, and that's the number I basically subscribe to. They had an opportunity to send one of their officials over to Helena, and he interviewed a number of people before basically he had to get out of town before he was lynched. But this is one of the worst, basically, race massacres that has occurred in the United States, and possibly the worst. Now, the Army's official total was 20 African Americans, 5 whites were killed. And then basically what happened was, is typically occurred in these situations, it would be the blacks who were arrested. No whites were arrested. The governor of Arkansas came over on the troop train with the men and was allowed by the commander of the forces to head the march into Helena the next day, and Governor Bruff met with what they call the Committee of Seven, and it was basically the white power structure in Phillips County, and basically made a deal with them to the effect that if there would be what he called no lynchings, he would basically let them conduct, the investigation and just kind of wash his hands of the whole thing. And he went back to Little Rock and basically extolled the 5 whites who were killed as martyrs. And then there was, at that point, there was a trial of the African Americans who basically they were put on trial, and it was basically kangaroo trials. You had a number of blacks who pled not guilty and entered into plea bargains, and there were like about 60 some odd African Americans who entered into plea bargains. But 12 of the blacks who were charged were put on trial and basically had kangaroo trials. There was no effort to defend them by the whites who were appointed, and 12 African Americans were sentenced to die in the electric chair. I'll be happy to continue, but you might want to ask me some specific questions on what happened. I kind of feel like I'm rambling.
Oh, no, you're not rambling at all. I'm really enjoying the narrative because I read your book closely, and I just commend you for the work it took to put together that narrative. And I was amazed as well because, that's a combination of a very hot summer, one of the most violent on record, if not the most violent summer for race relations in the United States history, post-Civil War. To culminate with that type of event in Elaine, Arkansas, the fact that it was high, the estimates of death or dead were 856 African Americans to 5 whites. You can say, I guess the white power structure, they overreacted, but their point was made. But I'm just curious, has anybody else came forward from the African American community or from the white community for that matter? What are the mass graves? I heard that people were thrown into the Mississippi River. Is that correct?
That's what, there are a couple of, there's more than, one story about that. There supposedly, I wish I could pull that open real quick. And then blacks were, one story has it that a number of blacks are buried underneath a hardware store in Elaine. Another story has it that a number of blacks, after they were shot down in the fields, were loaded onto a railroad car and taken to, I guess, near the Mississippi River and dumped in basically the swamp. But I'm not aware that, any bodies that were recovered. But, that's one thing that has not been fully investigated is, really what happened to the bodies. Ideally, that would have been really researched. We would have had people who would have been flying over in airplanes with infrared to detect, the presence of bodies, and none of that kind of research has occurred. So basically, we're left with kind of secondhand accounts. Some of them very compelling, though. We have 2 affidavits from members from men who had been members of the posse, and they gave affidavits in court stating that they had seen African Americans literally just shot down in the cotton fields, men, women, and children. I mean, part of this really was the panic that occurred when this began. You had all kinds of rumors, and whites would claim that there was this big insurrectionary plot, and as it turned out, none of that was true. Whites, were shot down, but also what happened was blacks were put into temporary stockades and tortured. There were, the soldiers were there along with the white mob, and the soldiers also built these temporary stockades and arrested blacks just, by the wholesale numbers, just put them in these stockades, and there's evidence too that some of the blacks were tortured by the soldiers into giving information, because there was this thought that there was somehow going to be this insurrection. And so blacks were taken from the stockades and put into the Phillips County Jail. And blacks again were tortured, and we have the evidence of that by the affidavits given by the posse as well. So, I mean, there's plenty of evidence that we talk about torture, being overseas and,
right.
Iraq and all of that, but we've had our own torture going on a lot closer to home, which people are aware of that.
I mean, I would like to point out, when you talk about the two affidavits that really turned around this case in terms of Elaine 12, how they were prosecuted, was by people that actually participated in the shooting, like posse members, I guess H.D. Smitty and T.K. Jones is a boss.
Right.
Missouri Pacific Railroad.
Those affidavits, you're right. Once those affidavits were filed in federal court, the whole case began to turn around. I mean, what we hadn't talked about was the fact that, the 12 were put on trial, given kangaroo trials. A jury was out, 5 minutes, and bingo, you had people waiting to die in the electric chair. And that precipitated these appeals that went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. I mean, there was an awful lot of legal work that went into saving these guys' lives. And one of the heroes was this African-American named Scipio Africanus Jones, who was an African-American lawyer in Little Rock who had become very well known, obviously, in the African-American community, because he was the in-house counsel for the Mosaic Templars, and the Mosaic Templars was a huge business in Little Rock that had gotten started. It was a burial insurance program, and Scipio Jones was its attorney, and it had been begun really in the 19th century and grew into a phenomenal business. They had offices in 26 states and in some foreign countries as well. And they had their office right there in Little Rock. And Scipio Jones was the leading black attorney in Little Rock at the time. And he represented some of the Elaine 12. So did this white attorney named Colonel George Murphy. He had been hired actually by the national office of the NAACP. And he and Scipio Jones and a man named Edgar Mahaney, who was in Murphy's law firm, represented the 12. And it turned out that Murphy, who had been incredibly enough, a Civil War veteran who was a kind of a leading attorney in Arkansas. He was ancient by then. He was in his 80s, but still trying cases. But he died in the middle of the trials of the Elaine 12. Once they filed a motion, they were able to file a motion for a new trial, and so they remanded the cases back to the trial court in Helena, and that's where Murphy got sick during the trials, and it ended up with Scipio Jones and Edgar McHaney trying the cases, and I mean, it was an awful lot of legal stuff that went on, and it's very, very complicated, and really more complicated than I can explain over the telephone.
Right.
I mean, I go into that all in my book, but they really did some superb legal work, and it ended up with the United States Supreme Court sending the case of 6 of the defendants back to be heard in the U.S. District Court, and that's where those affidavits came in handy. Somehow, Edgar McHaney, I think, was one who gets credit for this. Somehow, he persuaded 2 of the deputies who were involved in the killings to give affidavits, sworn statements about what had happened, and it was these guys, as you said, T.K. Jones and
Smitty.
Smitty, H.F. Smitty, who gave these affidavits saying that, you know, they had been there and they had seen blacks shot down, you know, in the cotton fields. And once those affidavits were filed and became known to the, you know, to the government, they lost their appetite for trying these cases real quick, and they were willing to enter into basically a deal where the 6 of the Elaine 12 entered into a deal where they were out for time served and given furloughs, but it was Scipio Africanus Jones who really gets the credit for shepherding those cases through to completion, and he ended up, by then the governor of Arkansas was Thomas McRae, and it was McRae who ended up signing this order that allowed the last of the Elaine 12 to go free. There were 6 others who were on kind of a different legal track, but one of the things, you know, that came out of this was how outstanding an attorney Scipio Africanus Jones was, and the Arkansas Gazette, even, which was no fan of the Elaine business, that they had to recognize that Scipio Jones had really kind of soldiered on through. I mean, this went on for years, you know, with these cases going up to the Supreme Court, and you know, it would. I think it was 1923 when finally the Elaine 12 all were out, and so, but of course that didn't end, you know, what was the kind of the legacy of slavery, and you know, the sort of lynchings and white supremacy and peonage, you know, continued almost for as long as you know, we've had African Americans in Arkansas. So, you know, it was a kind of a great victory, legal victory, but it didn't really slow down a lot of the practices that accompanied the legacy of slavery in Arkansas, which has been white supremacy and all that has entailed.
I mean, like, I think your book did, like, a great job. Like you said, this conversation cannot do the book that you wrote any type of justice he did a very great job in just really defining not only what happened the morning of October the 1st, 1930, or even not 1930, 1919, or September 30th of 1919, but also to set the mood for what happened during that time. Like, you really looked at it from a psychological point of view as well, from both the black and the white. And there's so much stuff to get into, just what you just said with Scipio Jones.
That's something I think is worth elaborating on. For so long, whites and blacks have been in denial. So many people, even over in Phillips County, when we went over for this conference in 2000, we found out that there were a number of people who said that they had never even heard of that we called them men at the time Elaine riots, but they knew what we were talking about, but they said, we've never heard of this. And people, people would not talk about these things, and that was the hard part of the research, is trying to find people who would say, yeah, my grandfather or father was part of this, because, they knew that it had become a matter of, a real investigation. For so long, it had been they tried to pass it off as something that, blacks had basically tried to have this insurrection. I mean, it was just a ridiculous story that blacks were going to seize the land of the white landowners, and there was not any evidence for that at all, and all of that basically was proved at the trial. There was no evidence of that anyway, but people would that went on for years, that historians would not really come to terms and say, look, what happened was a massacre. It wasn't this uprising by blacks. It was, they wanted to eliminate the labor union, and which they did. In fact, a number of the people who were head of the labor union, they had their property stolen. Their cotton crop was seized. Even at one point, they went into their houses and stole their property. And of course, the labor union, was just eliminated in one fell swoop, and that was part of the aim. But my own feeling about this is that a lot of the reaction was that fear that here you're going to have blacks, finally standing up, and they're going to attack us, and they're going to start killing us because of what we've done in the past. And what had been done in the past was first slavery, and then basically peonage. Blacks were routinely cheated over, when it came time to weigh their cotton, and that had gone on for years. And of course, that was why the labor union was started. But I mean, there was that kind of age-old fear. We're going to finally get it. Blacks are going to, get revenge and retribution for the past. And there was this incredible overreaction. One thing I did not mention was that there were a few African Americans, it's been documented, who did try to resist. Some of them had been in the army over in France, in the First World War, and they had come back, and that was kind of prompted some of the trials. There was, they were able to show that a black had fired at a white. I don't know how on earth he could have been convicted. There was no eyewitness, but there was evidence of some resistance. And, ideally, some people would like to make that there had been more resistance than there was. I've not seen the evidence for, just a quote, revolt or anything, but, blacks did not just take it absolutely lying down when the white mob came in, and of course, I still think it was the soldiers who may have killed more blacks than even the mobs. Because what happened when the soldiers got there is that they did disarm some of the mob, and the mob left the next day, and it left the soldiers there for 4 or 5 days before they left. But it was during that time, the blacks had fled into the canebrake, and they were obviously scared to come out. And, there's 3 or 4 accounts of wholesale slaughter of blacks at that point by the soldiers. One of the things that is now being investigated, I hope, by the law school, there is, I think we discussed, this Northeast Law School in Boston has a law school class in which they try to investigate cold case civil rights murders. You may know that there was legislation in Congress that appropriated some money to investigate civil rights murders from the 60s.
Yeah, Emmett Till bill.
Yes. And one of the things that this law school class has done is to basically, I got a telephone call, I guess it's been a month ago, saying that they were interested in investigating what the participation of the federal government in these murders, and hopefully that'll be something that can be done. We've never really come to terms with this. I mean, we have over in Little Rock, we've got a statue of the Little Rock Nine, but we don't have. We've never recognized what happened in Elaine, and it was far more egregious and I mean, as awful as what happened in Little Rock in 1957. There were no students killed, and you have, maybe hundreds of people killed in Phillips County, but we really hadn't been able to get that together.
I mean, I just think it's interesting, like the fact that you talk about the town still having come to grips with their past, and really is suffering in their present because it's like they've been stagnated. When I read in your book, at first, it like Elaine and Helena area was a good place to start invested in. Like, the city or the town fathers were really trying to push Elaine into a great, powerful little town. But since that time, it's like it's been declining. What I had read recently, or what I saw news that especially did a story on what you talked about, the interview you. They're talking about how the Elaine lost their school system and how the town was really just dead economically.
Yeah,
and socially.
They struggled. Yeah. Yeah. Well, a lot of what has happened over in the Arkansas Delta has been a lot of white flight since the 60s, and in 1970, when the United States Supreme Court just absolutely declared that there would be a unitary school system, white school districts no longer could avoid, meaningful desegregation. They had these so-called freedom of choice plans and pupil assignments, which was basically an effort to avoid school integration. So finally, when the Supreme Court ordered a unitary school system, that's where when a lot of the major white flight started. And so a lot of the Arkansas Delta, where I'm from, has really been left kind of with, underfinanced school districts and, there are a lot of racial tension. So, where I'm from in Marianna, which is between Forest City and Helena, we had a boycott that went on for a year and that ended, it was demands by African Americans for jobs and, some other things that had been going on for years, obviously, and so there was this basically standoff and a boycott, and then there was arson and some, violence, and it left the county in real bad shape, and I don't know that the city has ever fully recovered from that. But, I mean, Florida City and Helena and Arkansas Delta generally has suffered as a result of the past and its failure to come to terms with, what has happened. I mean, so much of what happened in the Arkansas Delta was that, white school boards took money from black schools. I mean, that's been documented over and over. And, of course, it was the case when I was in school in the 60s. I mean, all you had to do was really look at what our school, T.A. Futrell, had compared to what Robert R. Moten had in the way of facilities and textbooks, and that's been documented. So, I mean, there's a lot of reason for those Delta towns to be in sad shape financially and educationally, and it's something that we've never dealt with.
So like some type of educational opinion is going on there in Delta with it. It went from the fields into the classrooms in terms of the African Americans' access that the white citizens had. So, all right, man, so much in your book. I really commend you on writing that book because it raises so many questions, and it makes you think about a lot of things that are still, like you said, you talk about the issue of torture, the fact that so many people in that trial process were tortured. They were whipped, and all this stuff. They were forced to snitch, quote unquote, on their comrades and whatnot, and to make up stories that were not true. And also, I look at we talk about the white power structure, but also I like to touch upon the profiles and courage, the white individuals who stood up against the white power structure, who spoke truth to power, like Ulysses Bratton.
Well, and there were certainly people in that story who did that. One of the whites who was a man named Ulysses Bratton.
Mm-hmm.
And Bratton was an attorney in Little Rock, and he was actually hired to represent the union. And it turned out he had sent his son, a man named Osher Bratton, over there the very day that the shootout at Hoop Spur had occurred, and Osher Bratton was supposed to meet with some of the union members, and it turned out he walked right in the middle of the whole beginning of the race massacres. And the whites, of course, over there thought he was part of the whole deal, and so they put him in jail. And so he stayed, and he was taken and placed in. At first, he was put in this storefront there in Elaine, and kind of had a bird's eye view of what was going on. Then they put him on the train and took him into Helena and put him in jail along with some of the blacks who they had arrested. And it was about 30 days before his father could get him out of jail. But as it turned out, you had people like Ulysses Bratton, who was hired by the national NAACP, and he went up to New York and Boston on a fundraising trip. And, of course, he was in a perfect position to describe the peonage, basically the kind of unfair system in which, whites basically stole money from their tenants when it came time, the sharecroppers, when it came time to weigh the cotton. Anyway, Bratton himself was one of the people that was allowed to give the oral argument to the United States Supreme Court when this case finally got argued. And it was, I'm sure it was a really exciting moment for him to be part of the oral argument to the United States Supreme Court. And Bratton was part of that, argument, and you had, I'm trying to think of other people who were involved, and I guess I think I mentioned Edgar McHaney was one of the lawyers who was able to represent the 12, and trying to think of other names. There weren't that many whites who were involved in this. I mean, on the other side of that, you had the African Americans who were, and I guess it's Scipio Africanus Jones who really does get the most credit for his participation. And let's see, there was that Judge Martineau.
Martineau, who became governor.
Yeah, I had forgotten him. Martineau was a chancery judge when some of these cases came up before him, and he ended up basically able to delay some of the cases so they could get up to the Supreme Court, and he was given credit for actually saving some of the defendants. They would have gone on and had a trial and executed some of the African Americans if it hadn't been for Judge Martineau basically gumming up the works and delaying it so the case could get up to the federal.
I mean, he was a true maverick in my term, a true political maverick. He stepped outside his jurisdiction to do that. I mean, he had a conscience. That's why I would say, like, it's great how you balance it out. But also, people like, McHaney ended up becoming the Arkansas State Supreme Justice because of Martineau refusing to back down from people saying that, he didn't have the experience, per se, to become a Supreme Court Justice in the state of Arkansas, but he stood to his guns and promoted him anyway.
Yeah, and one of the high points of all this for me was to see in Little Rock, the post office is now named after Scipio Africanus Jones.
Oh, wow.
In Little Rock, and that was really a neat day to get to go to that. Scipio Africanus Jones, let's see, I guess it was his granddaughter came down for the event, and I've got a photograph of me with her and a couple of other people, and it really tickles me to have that connection because she lives up in Chicago now.
Mm-hmm.
And, they lived in Little Rock, and it's just, history can be a pretty exciting field, and when you personalize it like that, it's been very meaningful.
I know just reading and looking at interviews that you have done in the past that this project you did about the Elaine, Arkansas massacre was supposed to be a novel based around the life and times of Scipio Africanus Jones.
I think I mentioned that. That's actually what I was trying to do when I was over there at that conference. I was trying to write a novel. I've written actually 6 novels, 5 of them around the character of a lawyer named Gideon Page. But at that time, I was trying to write a novel about Scipio Africanus Jones, and I couldn't really get inside his head. I mean, we knew a lot of facts about what he had done, but never really knew enough about him to feel that comfortable. And I don't think, anyway, I couldn't get the novel published. But when I was one of the people, an editor actually at the University Press of Mississippi, suggested that I turn that into nonfiction as opposed to fiction. And I was able to do that. And the University Press of Mississippi didn't publish that book. The University Press of Arkansas did. But, yeah, I felt like by that time I at least had enough information to make his character interesting. But I don't take credit for having kind of discovered the importance of Scipio Africanus Jones. An earlier historian named Tom Dillard wrote first about Scipio Africanus Jones back in the 70s and had discovered his importance. And, you know, that's really kind of how history is done. It's always on the backs of somebody else. And, you know, there was another book. There were like 3 or 4 books written before mine. One of them especially was very good, and that historian actually came to Little Rock for the conference, and I got to meet him. And I mean, that's really how history's done, is people kind of working off the research of, you know, you find out something and then somebody else can take what you do later on and other things. So, you know, it's always a work in progress, and ideally we'd have more black historians, and we just don't have very many in Arkansas, and it would be so much better if we did, because a lot of times, understandably, African Americans are reluctant to talk to whites, and, you know, we have basically a history of suspicion, and rightfully so. So it's, you know, the more historians, the more diverse historians, the better, I think.
Oh, yeah, man. I mean, like, as far as being a historian, you got to have a lot of imagination as well, especially if you're doing research on stuff like this in terms of the availability of sources, of, you know, there's legitimate sources, and be able to piece stuff together. You got to be like a forensics expert, so to speak, when you're doing historic work of this nature. So I commend you on that. And what I would like to say about Scipio Jones is the fact that it's like he's a forerunner of a Thurgood Marshall in terms of using the legal system to work out the injustice within the society against people of color. But also he's a disciple of Booker T. Washington in terms of being I don't want to say appeaser, but accommodator, so to speak, in terms of, you know, his leadership.
He did what he had to do. You know, that he, you know, in retrospect, you can say, well, you know, he kind of did what he had to do at that particular time. I mean, I consider him to be a genuine civil rights hero, and he was a forerunner of other African-American lawyers in Arkansas for sure. And, you know, people like that, you know, there was a time, you know, when people would say, well, Scipio Jones was kind of an Uncle Tom, and I really don't think that's fair. I think he was able to take whatever he could get at that particular time in history, and, you know, when all said and done, he was the guy that negotiated. By the time those cases were over, he had gotten every one of the black defendants out of jail, and that included the guys who had entered into plea bargains. What had happened, I mentioned that earlier, several of them had entered, like 61 of them, had entered into plea bargains up to, some of them had pled guilty to second-degree murder, all the way down to this crime of night riding, which would have been a year in jail. But by the time this was over in the mid-1920s, you had every one of those African-American defendants, including all the Elaine 12, was out of jail. And you can't do any better than that. And he gets credit for that. And the NAACP, to its credit, recognized what he had done, and he, you know, was celebrated by the NAACP nationally, as he well should have been. And, you know, he really deserves a place in history. And, you know, that was back in the day when, you know, it was a different story. The story was, and I think I have this in the book, was when he came back to try those cases, he stayed with a different black family every night because of the fear that he might be assassinated. I mean, you know, it was no picnic coming back over to Phillips County to try those cases after they had been reversed. And, you know, he had guts, had really the guts to do that. And whoever his granddaughter Hazel Adams, who is the lady I was talking about, who lives in Chicago, she knows what he was all about and couldn't be more proud. She had told me once there was a diary that his daughter had kept, and she's never been able to find it, but she said she was going to write her own book about him if she could ever find it, but I don't think she has.
No, that's amazing. There's so much to look at. I know also you did talk about that in the book about him staying with different families or different places at night to keep from getting killed, but also the fact that Colonel Murphy, who was a Confederate, war veteran from the Civil War, when he got sick, he started getting sick, like you said, during the Elaine case, the fact that you put in the book that the doctor was treating him, I believe, in Phillips County, said that he would do all he can to save his life as a doctor, but as a man, he didn't really give a damn. He didn't say it like that, though. That's what I'm saying. I just thought that was fascinating.
I remember, that is just amazing. I mean, they hated those guys coming over there, and it makes you think what it is like for people like John Walker of Little Rock, who is our leading civil rights attorney, to go into all these towns and try cases all over Arkansas, knowing, how much he was resented and hated. And, as a lawyer, I know it's no fun. Once you leave Little Rock to go over and try a case someplace else, you keep thinking that you're going to get some home cooking, and you just got to be prepared for it. But, there has been a generation of civil rights attorneys just like everywhere in the South. And, people like that really deserve a lot of credit because they didn't just talk the talk, they walked the whole thing, and they can never get enough credit, in my opinion, because they went through this fire to get all that and just worked themselves to the bone.
Yeah, I have to say with Scipio Jones, I don't think people, because it's hard to judge somebody from our modern times, like you said in the book several times, about, it's hard to put a value of people's character looking through these, present-day eyes. I look at Scipio Jones, I would not call him an Uncle Tom, but I think it being the fact that he was a son of a house slave and a slave owner, that he understood white folks' psychology because he was raised around white people, and his father was white.
And that's exactly right. He understood whites. He knew, what he needed to do exactly to get the most he could get for his clients, and he did that over and over and over. And you got to respect somebody like that.
And also, he was rare to me, the fact that he said he got out for everybody in the Elaine case when a lot of other folks gave up on him. He stood the whole his nearly 7-year journey and trying to get them guys free by any means necessary through the legal system. But the fact of the matter that, when I think about, the class divide in the black community, like the black middle class versus the black working poor or impoverished, the fact that he would stand his ground like that make him sort of an enigma because he was considered the black elite and the black leadership of black Arkansas. But at the same time, I don't know too many people from that class that would have stood like that, with those working poor.
And not only did he had really a foot in every kind of part of society. I mean, he raised, can't remember how much I said earlier, he had raised all this money from the Mosaic Templars and all the fraternal organizations for war bonds for the First World War. I mean,
right.
The guy who, he was a friend of Governor Donaghy. He knew Governor Bruff. I mean, he worked every angle he could, and then he also represented, people who were charged with murder. I mean, he liked. I think I put in the book. There's a photograph of him, kind of as a dandy. I think I there that he, had a walking stick, and he dressed very well. He and his wife had a maid. He, I think, had a chauffeur at one point. he played the part, and there wasn't any reason for him not to. But when it was time for him to go get in the courthouse and do the grunt work of representing criminal defendants, he was right there doing it, and it didn't matter whether he was having to deal with the worst racist or somebody who was, basically sympathetic like Colonel Murphy was. So he would have been a fascinating person to know, and it would really be neat if somebody could make a movie of his life. I don't think we're that far away from it, considering you wrote this great book you wrote about the massacres and really highlighted his contribution to that cause. Because when you're talking about, I'm just thinking about a lot of things about the reason why he earned the NAACP respect was not because he, got along with them per se. He didn't do everything they told him to do, because really the things in one of the cases, he had to act on his own unilaterally, like he pointed out, in terms of making deals behind the scenes with Governor McCrae and other folks, not with the permission of the NAACP. And I like that part, because basically he just went on himself and entered that deal. He didn't get permission from the NAACP. He went on and had the foresight to know what kind of deal he could get. And he called up, the prosecuting attorney over there and worked out the deal, and then basically presented that to the NAACP, and it worked out. It worked out as well as he could. I don't know how much better he could have done, or anybody could have done, because who knows what would have happened if they'd had to try those cases in federal court. It wasn't going to be a slam dunk, and so he made this deal and got his guys out, and they were able to go on with their lives. And it would be real interesting to, and people have talked about trying to track down, because a lot of those guys obviously left Arkansas.
I bet they would. I don't blame them.
I don't imagine. But nobody really knows, whatever happened to them. But there are two photographs of Scipio Jones standing there with
right.
each of the six of the defendants, and they're all dressed up in suits, and you got to know that was a proud moment for him to get those guys out.
Yeah, they don't look broken at all. I mean, I saw the pictures in your book, and they all look proud. Like they got their dignity and their humanity intact, their manhood. They don't say they broken in spirit or anything like that. And he did look proud. It was definitely a proud thing. I think my criticism of the NAACP from a historical point of view has always been, like you even pointed out in terms of being an advocacy group, that they was more interested in, let's say, publicity and a moral victory versus a real victory. I mean, Scipio Jones, he was like a general. He was a competitor. He wanted to really win and get them guys off the hook, whereas the NAACP was looking at publicity to raise money for the organization. And this is what, they didn't really look at the real victory. Like, I even think that if Daisy Bates was in Little Rock, the NAACP wouldn't win as far as Little Rock 9. Or you look at Medgar Evers in Mississippi, or Robert Williams in North Carolina, for example. They all had to step outside their comfort zone, from the NAACP national headquarters in order to get things done locally.
Well, there's always that tension, and, what is their response? Is it to set some kind of legal precedent that will apply to everybody, or is it, for somebody like Scipio Jones, his job was to get those guys out of jail, and
yeah.
So there's always that tension when you have a national organization like that, because they really do, as you point out, have different goals than kind of the rank and file who people are on the ground that are in jail, and so I think that tension is kind of inherent in, when national organizations deal with local people, sometimes they have different goals, but sometimes they've got the money and they've got the firepower. They were able to get this man named Moorfield Story to argue the case, before the Supreme Court. And of course, he was kind of famous white lawyer who had all the contacts, and so people like that are in it. One of the things that I regret most is that Scipio Jones was not allowed to be one of the attorneys to argue the case before the Supreme Court and
Right.
let Bratton do it, and I think that was unfortunate, and I think Scipio Jones, that would have been his, a peak experience for him. That's every lawyer's dream, to argue before the Supreme Court, because he actually did all the legwork to get the case, all the pleadings and all the records and everything, and yet he wasn't allowed to argue it with Moorfield's story. But that's that's the way.
Yeah. Well, what was interesting, like you said, Moorfield's story. I mean, I'm just fascinated by the fact, like, this happened. This was like the Civil War was even 100 years ago when this stuff was happening. The fact that Moorfield's story was, like you pointed out, an intern for the great Senator Charles Sumner from the East. And it was like, that's how old he is. I was just thinking about, man, this man old. He was a page for him. So Senator Charles Sumner.
I mean, it makes you realize that this stuff wasn't that long ago.
Right.
I mean, it just kind of blows you away to, especially, I don't know, I'm writing a book now about a fire that killed 21 African-American boys at the Negro Boys Industrial School outside of Little Rock, and that was in 1959, and you go back just 100 years, and here we were on the verge of the Civil War. So this stuff, even though it may seem like it's been a long time ago,
right,
it really hadn't. And, so much of what's happened is just really part of our present. So,
and I also heard this part, the irony of the whole thing, like you talk about the affidavit signed by Smitty and Jones, his boss, was the fact that most of the whites probably died by friendly fire more so than gunfire from the African Americans that they were hunted down.
Yeah, that'll be one of the big mysteries, how McCaney was able to get those guys to sign those affidavits. There's so much about this stuff we still don't know. If somebody ever was able to track down those two men and find out what motivated them to sign those affidavits, it would really be interesting, because they must have been marked men. I
just imagine what you talked about, how it was hard for them to have, keep a job to support their family.
Right.
The difficulties. I feel sorry for them. I said, well, a lot of folks lost their lives that night. I feel sorry for y'all, but y'all participated in it as well, too.
Yeah, but I don't, one of them, I think it was Smitty, basically admitted he shot one of the black guys.
The gals, the Milligan gals.
Right, yeah. He basically admitted he committed murder, and I don't know that anything ever happened to him, but of course nobody was going to prosecute him because he would have implicated a whole lot of other people.
Basically friends and family and stuff like that. But he wanted Milligan Giles. He didn't kill him. Fortunately, he didn't kill him. He just wanted him.
Well, I think you're right. I misstated that. Yeah.
No, it's in your book. You didn't misstate it. You got a lot of you wrote it down in your book, so it's already published for all time. So you got it right. But I was looking at the fact that even what happened to the Johnson brothers was a travesty. I looked at the fact how you talked about the coverage versus like the media coverage was very prejudiced towards the African American community at that time, and also the lack of media coverage from the black press. I know Chicago Defender did what they could do, and the NAACP did what they could do with Walter White going down there and investigating before he got lynched himself. But it's like if you look at the media coverage, it doesn't really tell the whole story of that time.
Yeah, and I guess it's going to always be that way. There's going to be, some slanted coverage. What is interesting to me is that so much of that, people did not really understand what was going on, in Phillips County. It was just chaos at one point. It would just really be helpful to find witnesses who could, really give some eyewitness testimony about what happened there.
No, like Johnson brothers, that really bothers me in terms of like he had his prominent brothers who were well-to-do, business-minded, well regarded in the African American community, not only in Arkansas but across the country even. And they held them gunned down like that, and nobody gives a true explanation of what happened to those guys.
And that will be one of the biggest mysteries is what was that all about? Because those guys were just basically executed.
Were they able to find their bodies? Like, I'm gonna ask, like, were there any funerals at all, or anybody ever be found in terms of the victims? I know that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I don't know that. I mean, I wish I knew more about what that was all about. It just defies imagination that they were. I think I've got in there. They were taken off the train.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, they were very well-to-do, people. I mean, that was one of them. I think was a doctor, and I think they'd been on a hunting trip.
Right. D.A.E. Johnson was a dentist, but all of them were very successful. I think one was a doctor, but all of them were very successful, prosperous people who were basically, it didn't matter what class they were, they still were, regarded less than a white man. So, but my thing is this also is the fact that, I know you stated in the book that there was 103 life insurance policies that were cashed in. So we know like over 100 people were at least killed.
Yeah.
If anything else, more than the 20 the Army said.
The best evidence that you had that many, at least that many people killed was burial insurance policies, the life insurance policies. It's just, I think that pretty much nails that many, but goodness knows what else went on, and there are bound to be people in Phillips County who are still alive who know, some details of those stories that have never been told, and it would really be a good thing if people would start talking about that. I think, there are a lot of soldiers who participated in that, who wrote diaries and stuff, and that information is available, probably locked away in somebody's trunk and, just waiting to be discovered. And whoever does, it'll be a gold mine of information about that period.
Yeah, I'll agree with you on that as well, because I just think it's fascinating, the mentality of the government in terms of the military, because even the FBI, at least the FBI, they kept notes and they kept detailed notes and stuff. They never threw away anything about who they were spying on and who were informing in the Klan and stuff like that. And the military, they specialize in cover-up the scenes, even to this day. If you look at recently the Pat Tillman case and other things, like the cover-up sometimes is worse than the crime.
Right, and that's why I think it's so important that this law school, this Northeastern University, is going to ask the military, the United States military, to reinvestigate the instances of torture that occurred over in Elaine. We've got, we just think of that as not necessarily part of our military. Of course, now we know it is, and those kinds of things ought to be reinvestigated and made known to make people realize, this has probably always been part of our history. And, you'd like to think it wasn't, but in fact it was, and that kind of information ought to be disclosed and made available to the public so we can get our house in order.
Yeah, cause I always talk about, I know you're probably a Civil War historian as well, too, or buff, or whatever you want to call it, because it's a very fascinating period in American history. But they always talk about Andersonville, the prisoner camp down south, but then there was a prisoner camp that was probably way worse than Andersonville in Chicago. I can't remember the name right now offhand, but, they were doing a lot of terrible things to prisoners of war in Chicago, the land of Lincoln. But Andersonville is the only one you really hear about. I believe it's Andersonville. It's very infamous. But
right.
Even like in I think by World War II, like I don't know, like maybe it's a stigma of you investigate these things. There's like the boy who cried wolf or something like that. So I remember like about over 10 years ago as well that you had the incident down in Mississippi where this guy came forward and said there was a massacre at Camp Van Dorn. I believe that's the name of it. During World War II. There was like a government massacre of African American soldiers. And you had, I believe, the NAACP and I believe members of the Congressional Black Caucus and other folks involved in investigating that. And what I get from it, it said it was a hoax. It was a hoax. It never happened, that the guy made up the story or whatever. And my thing is that if the Tuskegee experiment could happen, if what happened in Elaine could happen, then maybe that could have happened too, but maybe it could have been somewhere else. You know, like you'll never know, because this stuff, like you said, recurs all the time. And, you know, if the military is willing to lie about certain things, like even look at during the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin incident never happened. Not the way that they describe it, it never happened, but it helped escalate the Vietnam War.
Well, you know, we've got things like the 1904 St. Charles Massacre, where 13 African Americans were lynched in DeWitt, Arkansas.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've got things like that in our history all through Arkansas, not to that extent, but, you know, there have been several what they call racial cleansing incidents, you know, that have taken place where blacks literally have been chased out of, you know, their town. I mean, we've got in Harrison, you know, Arkansas, we had that happen, I think it was 1904, 1906, maybe 1908, and you know, in several towns we've got what they call sundown towns, and obviously those are towns where blacks have been chased out and are not welcome, and we've got that all through northern Arkansas, you know, and of course the Ku Klux Klan is still around, so, you know, things have changed, but not to the extent that any of us would like, I think. And then, of course, you get something horrible like what happened in Norway, and you kind of realize this stuff has never passed.
Exactly. I don't know, like what William Faulkner used to say, or he wrote. Also, like, I think you did a great job of showing what happened to Aftermath. I mean, like, you think about it, several years later, after the last of the Lane 12 is released, we got the Scottsboro Boys, who's kind of similar in terms of all the up and down the legal process. But like, then you talked about the John Carter lynching, which was very, like, horrible to me just to read about how you wrote about it. It was very graphic in terms of what they did to John Carter because they couldn't get that guy, Lonnie Dixon.
Goodness.
And that was in Little Rock.
That, you know, was in 1927, and there's still information coming out on that. I've got a friend who's working on a new book about that, and it'll be real interesting to see what she's able to dig out. I know, you know, there's some more information. You know, you'd love to think that every time you write a book you get something right, but I think there's going to be a lot more information coming out.
Well, like you said, but history is built on the back of others, right? You did your part.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, you did whatever you could at the time of hand, like your hero, Scipio African Jones. He took lemons and made lemonade. He did what he could with the resources he had at his disposal at the time. And the fact that he had the presence of mind, I mean, it must be very exhausting for him to always be, like, thrown in this conflict in terms of trying, like, he's trying to save the whole African-American race in the state of Arkansas. And to have this, like, after he got the Lane 12 out, to have this happen in his hometown, it had to be very disheartening. I mean, but they were able to save African-American lives. They were able to keep the white folk. But it seemed like, to me, what was weird about the whole thing, like, you know, what Governor Braw, I mean, he was a Mississippian, and he was a very impressive man on his own standards in terms of his intellectual capabilities, as you point out in the book. But the fact that a person like that can rationalize people being treated like that, like you have this intellectual capacity to reason and to rationalize, but at the same time they say, you know, that it was people in the African-American community that actually saw him as an ally, and he was considered progressive for his time, which I guess he was.
Right, you're saying, and it's true that he was considered the most progressive white man that had occupied the governor's office, you know, that there'd been, and, you know, it just kind of scares you to think that as he was the best we had, you know, what the worst was like, and of course,
exactly.
you know, we had, you know, a lot worse than that, and it just kind of shows you think you made some progress, and then maybe you hadn't made as much as you thought you had.
I mean, the fact that Robert Hill, the leader of the union, the governor of Kansas, refused to extradite him to Arkansas, even though they got lynchings in Kansas too now. It shows you the type of respect that, or the type of perception people had of what was going on in Arkansas.
Well, I'd actually kind of forgotten the Kansas. I didn't really cover much of that in the book about the whole extradition procedure, but I mean that was definitely part of it, and it took some guts to go over there and do that. You have to admire, you know, some of the people that have really stayed the course as far as being advocates for civil rights.
I mean, also another person I thought was interesting because, like, you know, you look at this Elaine 12. It's like an OJ trial. A lot of people got promoted, except maybe for the defendants or whatever. But a lot of folks made their career in terms of providing a platform for upward mobility. Like I think about John Miller, the prosecutor.
And I hadn't even thought about that. You know, the prosecutor in that case, you know, ended up a federal district judge. And
also he was a senator, too, a United States senator and a congressman, a representative.
Yeah, and so, you know, he did make his reputation there. But, you know, he also tried to get on the right side of history at the years later by ending up, you know, making it seem like it wasn't that big a deal when people were trying to remember what he actually was. They took his deposition. A historian, like on Dr. Brown, Walter Brown, took his deposition, just interviewed him about what had happened in Elaine, and of course he made it. Which it was the judge helped me on this. I'm going to have to open my book, and I'm not going to be able to find it. That interview.
Yeah, you were saying basically that the black workers were being cheated through the peanut system. He said they did exist, but you know, he thought that you know it wasn't.
Right. Go ahead.
No, he also thought it wasn't really what the white folks thought it was. The white power structure. It wasn't really a riot, or you know, it wasn't really a insurrection. That they might have overreacted.
Right. He also was talking about that they had come through, that 100 blacks had been shot. That he made it sound like it wasn't really a riot. That the 100 blacks, I'm trying to remember. I need to go back and look at my book. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, it's actually there for posterity. That's a good thing. It's there for posterity.
I'm kind of running out of time on this.
Yes, sir.
We got any more? I mean, can you about through with me or what?
Yeah, I'm almost about wrapped it up. I wish I could just talk. I could just talk to you and listen to you all day, though. You got so much information you're so passionate about.
I've written too many books. I'm starting to get my facts.
You got it written down. That's the most important thing. So you got it written down. But like with John Miller, with that whole thing, with that whole the Lane, Arkansas riots, I just think about they were talking about the Mississippi Party. It seems like to me that it might have been some folks from Mississippi that came up to Helena and Elaine, but I think the most damage was done by the people who actually lived in Arkansas. But it's they're trying to blame the people from Mississippi.
That was some kind of home cooking when they.
Right, you know what I'm saying?
I have no doubt that some people came over from Mississippi.
Of course.
And maybe they were the worst in terms of cutting off years and, you know, all that stuff. But I suspect it was, you know, it wasn't a dime's bit of difference between growing up on one side of the Mississippi or the other, and for us to make it sound like it was just the Mississippians who were the most bloodthirsty, that's kind of a stretch. I kind of have to take that with a grain of salt.
I was going to ask you, what was the biggest surprise you found out when you was writing and researching the book? What's the biggest thing that hit you that, wow?
Well, you know, I'm kind of surprised at just finding out, you know, when I read about the affidavits that those two guys gave, that to me was the biggest, you know, I just couldn't believe. And, of course, I've gotten to read copies of that firsthand, and it's just amazing to see those guys admit, you know, that they've been a part of this stuff. So it just still kind of blows me away that those, you know, two guys, Smitty and Jones, would be willing to give affidavits. I still would love to have met those guys in person and ask them, you know, what they got out of it or what they were thinking or whatever. Because you know they've got family somewhere who know that story, and it sure be interesting to talk to them. But, you know, that's so far back in the past that everybody's gone, I guess. I don't know.
You never know. Like you said, it might be a diary line somewhere or something that somebody know about. This is weird to me because I know a lot of times, you know, I know Memphis, living in the Delta period, you got so much rich history, so much rich family history, so much rich cultural history. But like you look at people every day, don't know, you know, who their family is and what they did, you know, in a previous life, quote unquote. There a lot of folks don't take the time to really document this history or to share this history with the generations. And I think that's unfortunate. But there's so much richness here. And I'll talk to you about that as well with your book that you got, the current project, about the industrial boys' home, the industrial boys' home that burned down.
Let me mention one book, my latest book, just so I can get that out there. I wrote a book published 3 years ago called Ruled by Race, Black-White Relations in Arkansas from Slavery to the Present. And it really is a history of race relations from slavery all the way up to 2008. So if people are looking for a general history of race relations, it's in there.
I'll ask this too, like, have people, what's been the response to these books, in particular the Elaine book and also the race relations book? And are these on lists for reading? I mean, I think young people in Arkansas in the school system should be reading your books. Are they on a recommended reading list at all?
Well, actually, my book, Race Relations in the Natural State, has been adopted for use, or has been approved by the Arkansas Department of Education for use in the public schools. So,
that's great.
And it's a much smaller version of Ruled by Race, and it's written for school children, and it has lesson plans that track the standards that are supposed to be taught, you know, for Arkansas history. So that's been part of what I've been able to do as well.
So what has been the response from the Elaine book from the public?
It depends on who you know, is reading the book. I mean, there are people who are not at all happy with the fact that that book has been written, and I understand that because it doesn't paint a very positive picture of Phillips County, but I mean, it's part of our history, and we have to come to terms with it. So, you know, this is, you know, it's probably one of those books that the further we go on in time, the more people will read it because it's more bearable to read, you know, when you're far enough away from the time. I mean, these things that happen are so painful, and it causes such anxiety, and that it's something, you know, difficult for people to deal with. But the further, and that's the kind of the sad part of history, is that so much time goes that, you know, you're finally able to deal with it. But if you'd been able to deal with it at an earlier period in time, maybe you'd been able to change some things about the way people were living and it would make more of a difference. But it's better late than never, I guess.
Yeah, I was just wondering when you were saying that, what could be done in terms of a resolution to help not only bring some type of healing to this chapter, this unfortunate chapter, not only in Arkansas history, but American history. And I was thinking about with the Black Farmer settlement, I wonder how many people filed for a settlement who were connected to the Elaine, Arkansas incident. I mean, I wonder if anybody, family members of the deceased or whatever, have they filed, anything with the Black Farmer settlement in relation to that incident. It'll be interesting to find out. And also, I'd like to know, has anybody ever reached out to President Bill Clinton, famous son of Arkansas, who probably know a lot about this stuff in terms of being involved in some type of reconciliation project?
Yeah, I don't, of course, when he was president, I mean, that was one of his initiatives. Oddly enough, a historian named Jeannie Wayne, whom I actually mention in the book, suggested that I give Bill Clinton a copy of that book, and I left it for him somewhere, but I never heard anything, whether he had read it or not, or whether he even got it, so I don't know. I mean, it does seem like a natural thing for him to be involved with, but obviously he's got a lot on his plate, so, I don't know.
I mean, but you never know. You mean, you read Little Rock, you got the nice presidential library, you never know. You planted the seeds, you wrote the book, you did the hardest part there was to do. Now it's time for you to, open it up and either receive the information within or reject it, but nevertheless, consider it. Consider what you have to say, because you're making a case for folks who can no longer speak. That they want something to be done. So that's very powerful what you have done. So you should be commended on that alone. Because somebody that, because you think about it, Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas at one point, and you don't know who will read that book, who's going to be involved in the future story of Arkansas, or the nation for that matter, in terms of race relations and other things. So, I mean, you did a true public service to humanity by writing that book. And I know he'll be correct. It was a great read. I really enjoyed reading that book because there's so many things I found out. And I found out that, that sometimes, in order to do the right thing, you got to stand alone sometimes. And there's a price to be paid for everything, including freedom. So I just I want to ask you this before we go. What's been the progress with the Industrial Boys Home Fire book? Have you been lucky or blessed in getting people to talk about what happened in 1959?
No, that's been a problem, is getting people to talk about it. So, I mean, it's just a fact of life. I have not been really as successful as I'd like to have been in getting people to talk about what happened. But that's part of being a writer. You don't always get resources that you'd like to open up to you to do that. And, at some point you just have to go ahead and write what you know and hope that somebody will come along in the future and use whatever you've written to write a better book and to get more information. And that's about all you can hope for.
Well, that might be your novel right there, though. I mean, it's like you got a vivid, you have your imagination more involved, that you are an excellent writer. Maybe that's your novel right there. I mean, because, the fact that nobody's coming forward and you could probably expand, because nobody survived that fire, right? None of the boys inside the house.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, no. They did. You had 48 who did survive. It was just 21 who died, and 48 did survive. So,
okay.
There are people out there that know about it. It's just the kind of thing, though, that if you've been in that kind of environment, it's not like you are going to a school reunion where everybody gets together and talks about the good old days.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing good about what happened, but I mean, have the boys, the survivors, were they harmed physically? Were they burned, or they survived?
Well, we had about 3 who were burned and survived. Others got out through these windows and were able to get away, but it was just terrific for the families who went out there that morning, and because the bodies were burned so completely that it was just terrific. 14 of them couldn't be identified at all. I mean, in fact, L.C. Bates, even threw away the negative that was so horrific, the photograph that he had retained, and he advised his readers he was getting rid of the negative because it was just so grotesque. I mean, you can imagine what that must have been like that morning to drive out there to Wrightsville, which is outside of Little Rock, and there you had the governor out there, and you had the superintendent, and you were trying to identify your child, who some of them had just been put out there for just very little. I mean, they weren't hardcore felons. They were kids that had stolen things like bicycles and stuff like that, and some of them, were basically homeless, and they were just burned to a crisp. They were locked in from the outside, and it was just hideous.
Did they ever find out what caused the fire?
That's something that's never been found out. Never have, the fire marshal investigated. See, the governor basically wouldn't release any of that information. They had a grand jury investigation, and the grand jury things are secret, so a lot of that information is been hushed up, and, it makes people think there's some kind of a cover-up, and, it's one of these things that everybody would like to know more about, but what happens is, they let 50 years go by, and, people die, and their memories go bad, and, it's not easy finding out stuff.
Well, can you get the secretive files through the Freedom of Information Act? Are they available?
Well, that was before the Freedom of Information Act when this happened, so we don't have.
But you can't get the files. You can't request the files through that FOIA Act. You can't request them.
Well, I'm saying that the Freedom of Information Act wasn't in effect then. There wasn't any Freedom of Information Act in 1959. I don't think so.
We're going right now, something in the present, we'll be able to use that to get access to the files that stay secretive.
Well, the files that there were letters that were sent in to the governor's office.
Okay.
Some information that I've gotten, but not as much as I would have liked to have had.
Yeah, it was Governor Fathers, right? Was he the governor at the time?
He was the governor then, yeah.
And he was another progressive, right?
I'm about running out of gas here. I'm going to have to get off the phone. But I appreciate, you interviewing me. Is this still going to be on Wednesday?
Yes, sir. It's going to be on Wednesday night. Yes, sir. And I'll send you a link, an email with all the specifics.
And I enjoyed talking with you, okay?
You too, Brother Grif. You take care. Thanks a lot.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Bye.